blood, and loud thunder. Hazel McCall had spent her life chasing justice, not outlaws. But when Colt Rollins, the man she once loved and lost, was dragged into her jail cell, bleeding and grinning, she knew she was in trouble. He leaned against the bars, voice like a slow drawl. "You gonna keep me locked up, Sheriff?" he murmured. "Or you finally gonna admit you don't want me to leave?" Chapter 1. The Return of the Prodigal Outlaw. The late afternoon sun cast long, skeletal shadows across the dusty main street of Redemption, Arizona. Hazel McCall, sheriff of this forgotten corner of the territory, stood on the weathered porch of her office, the silver star pinned to her chest feeling heavier than usual. The air, thick with the scent of dry earth and distant wood smoke, held a stillness that was both familiar and unsettling. 58 years she'd lived, 40 of them in Redemption, and she knew the rhythm of this land like the back of her hand. This silence, though, felt different. It felt expectant. Hazel's gaze drifted towards the horizon, where the mesas rose like ancient, slumbering giants. Her eyes, the color of a stormy sky after a downpour, had seen a lifetime of hardship and resilience etched into the landscape. Lines crinkled at their corners, a testament to the years spent squinting against the harsh sun and the even harsher realities of frontier life. Her jaw, firm and resolute, was framed by strands of silver that had long ago overtaken the auburn of her youth. She wore her authority like a second skin, a necessary armor in a world where law and order were often as fluid as the shifting desert sands. A sudden commotion down the street shattered the quiet. The rhythmic thud of hooves, the jangle of spurs, the shouts of men, the sounds of trouble approaching fast. Hazel's hand instinctively moved to the worn leather holster at her hip, her fingers brushing against the smooth, cool grip of her Colt Peacemaker. Years of practice had made the motion second nature, a reflex honed by countless encounters with the lawless element that perpetually threatened to engulf their fragile community. 3 riders came barreling into town, kicking up a cloud of dust that momentarily obscured the setting sun. 2 of them, young and reckless, Hazel recognized as members of the notorious Blackwood Gang's small-time thieves and cattle rustlers who were more a nuisance than a real threat. But the third rider sent a jolt of something akin to ice water through Hazel's veins. He was slumped in the saddle, his head lolling, a dark stain blooming on his shirt. Even at this distance, even through the haze of dust and the obvious signs of injury, Hazel recognized him. The set of his shoulders, the way he sat a horse, the unruly dark hair that, even now, matted with blood, seemed to defy gravity. Colt Rollins. The 2 younger outlaws hauled Colt off his horse, practically dragging him towards the sheriff's office. He stumbled, his legs clearly weak, but he managed to raise his head, his eyes the color of whiskey aged in oak barrels locking onto Hazel's. A slow, crooked grin spread across his face, a grin that was both infuriating and undeniably charming. "Well, Sheriff," he drawled, his voice rough but laced with a familiar, teasing lilt. "Fancy meeting you here." Hazel's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the sudden, suffocating silence that had fallen over the town. 10 years. 10 years since she'd last seen that grin, heard that voice. 10 years since he'd ridden out of Redemption, leaving her with nothing but a shattered heart and a bitter taste of betrayal. The 2 Blackwood boys shoved Colt forward, and he stumbled again, catching himself on the hitching post. "He's all yours, Sheriff," one of them sneered. Caught him trying to steal Old Man Hemlock's prize stallion. Bled like a stuck pig, he did. Hazel ignored them, her gaze fixed on Colt. He was thinner than she remembered, his face gaunt and shadowed with weariness. The lines around his eyes were deeper, etched by a life lived on the edge. The boy she'd known, the boy she'd loved, was gone, replaced by this hardened, wounded stranger. Yet, beneath the surface, something flickered, a spark of the man he once was, a ghost of the connection they'd once shared. "Get him inside," Hazel ordered, her voice surprisingly steady despite the turmoil raging within her. She gestured towards the jail cells at the back of the office. "And then get out. This is my jurisdiction now." The Blackwood boys exchanged uneasy glances, clearly intimidated by Hazel's unwavering gaze. They knew her reputation. They knew she wouldn't hesitate to use that cult peacemaker if they pushed her. They mumbled something about expecting a reward and then scurried out of the office, leaving Hazel alone with Colt. He leaned against the bars of the cell, his breathing ragged. The blood stain on his shirt was spreading, a crimson blossom against the faded denim. "You gonna keep me locked up, Sheriff?" he murmured, his voice weaker now, the teasing tone replaced by a hint of vulnerability. "Or you finally gonna admit you don't want me to leave?" Hazel's throat tightened. His words, though spoken softly, echoed the unspoken question that had haunted her for a decade. Why had he left? Why had he chosen a life of outlawry over the life they could have had together? The questions, sharp and painful, threatened to overwhelm her. She forced herself to focus on the present, on the injured man before her. "You're bleeding, Colt," she said, her voice brisk and professional, a mask for the emotions churning beneath. "Let me see to that." He chuckled, a low, pain-filled sound. Always the practical one, Hazel. Even after all this time. She retrieved a basin of water and some clean cloths from the back room, her movements deliberate and controlled. As she approached the cell, she could smell the familiar scent of hymn leather, gunpowder, and something uniquely his, a scent that transported her back to their younger days, to stolen kisses under the vast, star-studded sky, to whispered promises that had ultimately been broken. She unlocked the cell door, the metallic clang echoing in the sudden silence. He didn't move, didn't resist. He simply watched her, his whiskey-colored eyes filled with a mixture of pain, defiance, and something else, something that looked a lot like regret. As she knelt beside him, her fingers trembling slightly as she reached for his shirt, she knew that Colt Rollins' return had not only reopened old wounds, but had also thrown her carefully constructed world into complete and utter chaos. And the worst part was, she wasn't entirely sure she wanted to put it back together. Chapter 2. Shadows of a Shared Past. The air in the small cell was thick with the coppery tang of blood and the unspoken weight of years. Hazel worked quickly, efficiently, her movements practiced from years of patching up the occasional brawl or gunshot wound that came with keeping the peace in redemption. She avoided looking directly at Colt, focusing instead on the task at hand, her fingers deftly unbuttoning his blood-soaked shirt. The fabric parted, revealing a long, jagged gash across his ribs, still oozing blood. It wasn't deep enough to be immediately life-threatening, but it needed cleaning and stitching. Hazel bit back a sigh. She'd dealt with worse, but never on a man who once held her heart in his hands. "Hold still," she murmured, her voice tight with a mixture of concern and a lingering resentment she couldn't quite suppress. Colt winced as she dabbed at the wound with a clean cloth soaked in water. "Easy, Sheriff," he said, his voice strained. "I'm not as tough as I used to be." A lie, Hazel thought. He was always tough, always resilient. It was one of the things that had drawn her to him in the first place. That and the wild, untamed spirit that had made him both irresistible and utterly impossible. As she cleaned the wound, her fingers brushed against his skin, warm and surprisingly smooth beneath the rough exterior. A jolt, unexpected and unwelcome, shot through her. She pulled her hand back as if burned, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "Sorry," she muttered, her cheeks flushing with a heat that had nothing to do with the desert sun. He looked at her then, his eyes searching hers. "No need to apologize, Hazel. It's been a long time." The simple statement, spoken with a quiet intensity, hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken accusations and unanswered questions. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the soft drip of water and Colt's shallow breathing. Hazel forced herself to break the gaze, turning her attention back to the wound. She retrieved a needle and thread from her medical kit, her hands steadier now, her emotions momentarily under control. "This is going to sting," she warned, her voice devoid of any warmth. He didn't flinch as she began to stitch the wound closed, his jaw clenched, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. Hazel worked with a practiced hand, each stitch precise and efficient. As she worked, Memories flooded back, unbidden and unwelcome. She remembered the first time she'd met Colt at a town dance. He'd been a young, brash cowboy, full of laughter and charm. He'd swept her off her feet, quite literally, twirling her around the dance floor until she was breathless and giddy. She remembered the stolen kisses under the moonlight, the whispered promises of a future together. She remembered the way he'd looked at her, as if she were the only woman in the world. And then she remembered the day he'd left. No goodbye, no explanation, just a note left on her doorstep, a few hastily scrawled words that had shattered her world. "I can't stay, Hazel. It's not the life for me. Forget me." She'd never forgotten him. She'd tried. God knows she'd tried. She'd buried herself in her work, in her duty to the town, in the pursuit of justice. She'd built a wall around her heart, a fortress designed to keep out the pain, to keep out any man who might threaten to breach it. But now, here he was, back in her life, back in her jail, bleeding and vulnerable. And the wall she'd so carefully constructed was crumbling, brick by brick. "Why, Colt?" she asked, the question escaping her lips before she could stop it. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it echoed in the small cell. He didn't answer immediately. He closed his eyes for a moment, his face etched with a pain that went beyond the physical. When he opened them again, they were filled with a sadness that mirrored her own. "It's a long story, Hazel," he said, his voice rough. "One you probably don't want to hear." "Try me," she challenged, her voice stronger now, fueled by a sudden surge of anger. "I've waited 10 years for an explanation. I think I deserve at least that." He looked at her, his gaze unwavering. "I did what I thought I had to do," he said. "For you, for me, for everyone." His words were cryptic, infuriating. "What does that even mean?" she demanded. He sighed, running a hand through his matted hair. "It's complicated, Hazel. There were things you didn't know. Things I couldn't tell you. Things like—" "What?" she pressed, her voice rising. "Like the fact that you were running with an outlaw gang? Like the fact that you were breaking the law, the very law I swore to uphold?" He flinched at her words, his eyes clouding with guilt. "It wasn't like that," he said. "Not at first." "Then what was it like, Colt?" she asked, her voice laced with bitterness. "Enlighten me." He remained silent, his gaze fixed on the floor. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Hazel finished stitching the wound, her hands moving mechanically, her mind racing. She tied off the thread, her fingers lingering on his skin for a moment longer than necessary. "You need to rest," she said, her voice softening despite herself. She stood up, gathering her supplies. "I'll bring you some food and water later." She turned to leave, but he reached out, his hand catching hers. His touch was surprisingly gentle, sending another unexpected shiver through her. "Hazel," he said, his voice low and urgent. Don't give up on me. Not yet." She looked down at his hand, at his calloused fingers wrapped around hers. She saw the desperation in his eyes, the plea for understanding, for forgiveness. And for the first time in 10 years, she felt a flicker of hope, a tiny spark of something that felt dangerously close to the love she thought she'd buried long ago. But could she trust him? Could she risk opening her heart to him again, knowing the pain he was capable of inflicting? The answer, she knew, was far from clear, buried somewhere in the shadows of their shared past, a past that was now threatening to collide with their present. Chapter 3. Whispers in the dusty cell. The heavy iron door clanged shut, the sound echoing through the otherwise quiet office. Hazel stood for a moment, her back against the cold metal, listening to the faint sounds of Colt shifting inside the cell. She felt drained, emotionally and physically exhausted by the encounter. The carefully constructed walls around her heart, the ones she'd spent a decade fortifying, felt precariously fragile. She walked to her desk, the worn wooden surface scarred with the marks of countless reports, wanted posters, and late-night cups of coffee. She sank into her chair, the leather creaking beneath her weight. The office, usually a sanctuary of order and control, felt suffocating. The scent of antiseptic and blood lingered in the air, a constant reminder of Colt's presence, just a few feet away. Hazel ran a hand through her hair, pulling at the strands that had escaped her braid. She needed to think, to analyze, to regain the composure that had always been her strength. But her mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions: anger, resentment, hurt, and a treacherous undercurrent of something she refused to acknowledge, something that felt dangerously close to hope. She glanced at the wanted poster tacked to the wall opposite her desk. It was an old one, faded and torn, but the image of Colt Rollins was still clear. Wanted, dead or alive, for robbery, cattle rustling, and aiding and abetting known outlaws. The list of charges was long, damning. It was a stark reminder of the man he'd become, the path he'd chosen. But the image on the poster didn't quite match the man in the cell. The poster showed a younger Colt, brash and defiant, with a cocky grin and a glint of mischief in his eyes. The man in the cell was older, wearier, his eyes shadowed with regret, his grin tinged with pain. Hazel sighed, pushing the poster aside. She couldn't rely on old assumptions, on past grievances. She needed to understand what had happened, what had driven him to this point. And she needed to do it without letting her emotions cloud her judgment, without letting the ghost of their past influence her decisions. She stood up, her resolve hardening. She was the sheriff, and she had a duty to uphold the law. But she was also Hazel McCall, a woman with a past, a woman with a heart that, despite everything, still ached for the man Colt Rollins once was. She prepared a simple meal: some leftover stew, a hunk of bread, and a canteen of water. She hesitated for a moment, then added a small tin of peaches, a memory of a shared picnic years ago, a gesture of something she couldn't quite define. As she approached the cell, she heard him moving around, the faint clink of chains. She paused outside the door, listening. He was humming a tune, a low, melancholic melody that she recognized. It was an old folk song, one they'd often sung together, sitting around a campfire under the vast, star-studded sky. Hazel took a deep breath, steeling herself. She unlocked the door and stepped inside. Colt was sitting on the edge of the cot, his back to her. He stopped humming as she entered, but he didn't turn around. "I brought you some food," Hazel said, her voice neutral, betraying none of the turmoil within her. He slowly turned, his eyes meeting hers. The lamplight flickered across his face, highlighting the lines of weariness and the faint stubble that shadowed his jaw. "Thank you, Hazel," he said, his voice low. She placed the tray on the small wooden table in the cell, avoiding his gaze. "Eat," she said. "You need to regain your strength." He nodded, but he didn't reach for the food. He continued to watch her, his eyes intense, searching. "Hazel," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know I have a lot to answer for. And I will. I promise you, I will tell you everything. But not now. Not like this." She hesitated, her hand hovering over the tray. She wanted to demand answers, to force him to confront his past, to explain his betrayal. But something in his eyes, a vulnerability she hadn't seen in years, stopped her. "When?" she asked, her voice softer than she intended. He looked down at his hands, his fingers tracing the lines on the worn wooden surface of the cot. "When I can look you in the eye and tell you the truth, the whole truth, without breaking." His words, raw and honest, struck a chord within her. She understood the need for strength, the fear of vulnerability. She'd lived with it for years. "All right, Colt," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "I'll give you that. But don't think for a moment that this means you're off the hook. You're still a prisoner, and you'll face the consequences of your actions." He nodded, a flicker of relief in his eyes. "I know, Hazel. I expect nothing less." He reached for the stew, his movements slow and deliberate. Hazel watched him for a moment, her gaze lingering on the way his hand trembled slightly as he lifted the spoon. She saw the exhaustion etched on his face, the pain in his eyes. And she saw something else, something that made her heart ache with a longing she thought she'd buried long ago. She saw a glimmer of the man she'd once loved, the man she'd believed in, the man she'd hoped he could still be. She turned to leave, the tin of peaches suddenly feeling heavy in her hand. As she reached the door, she paused, her back to him. "Colt," she said, her voice low and hesitant. "Why did you really come back?" He stopped eating, his spoon hovering over the bowl. He didn't answer immediately. The silence stretched, filled only by the soft sounds of the night, the distant howl of a coyote, the creak of the old building settling. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely audible. "Because I needed to see you, Hazel. One last time." His words, whispered in the dusty cell, hung in the air, a fragile thread of hope and regret, leaving Hazel with a feeling of unease, a sense of impending doom. Something told her this was only the beginning of a storm far more dangerous than any she had weathered before. Chapter 4. The Price of Loyalty and Betrayal. The dawn crept over the horizon, painting the sky in hues of pale orange and dusty rose. Hazel had barely slept, tossing and turning in her small cot in the back room of the office, her mind replaying the events of the previous day, Colt's words echoing in her ears. "I needed to see you, Hazel. One last time." The phrase was unsettling, carrying a weight of finality that she couldn't ignore. She rose, feeling the familiar stiffness in her joints, a reminder of the years spent riding patrol and chasing outlaws. She dressed quickly, pulling on her worn denim pants, a sturdy cotton shirt, and her boots. She strapped on her gun belt, the weight of the Colt Peacemaker a familiar comfort. As she stepped into the main office, she saw Deputy Eli Johnson, a young, eager man barely out of his teens, sitting at her desk, his eyes wide with concern. "Sheriff," he said, jumping to his feet. "I heard about Rollins. Is it true? He's really back?" Hazel nodded, her expression grim. "He is. And he's injured. I stitched him up last night." Eli's eyes widened further. "Injured? How bad?" "Bad enough," Hazel said. "But he'll live. For now." She didn't elaborate. She didn't want to share the details of her encounter with Colt, the conflicting emotions that were still churning within her. "What are you going to do, Sheriff?" Eli asked, his voice filled with a mixture of apprehension and excitement. "Are you going to send for the circuit judge? He's due in Silver Creek next week." Hazel hesitated. Sending for the judge was the logical, the lawful thing to do. Colt was a wanted man, with a long list of charges against him. He deserved to face trial, to answer for his crimes. But something held her back. A nagging doubt, a whisper of uncertainty. Colt's words, his plea for time, his promise to explain everything, they resonated within her, creating a conflict between her duty as a law officer and the lingering embers of her past feelings. "Not yet, Eli," she said, her voice firm. "I need to assess the situation. I need to talk to him again." Eli looked surprised, but he didn't argue. He knew better than to question Hazel's judgment. He'd seen her in action, seen her unwavering commitment to justice, her ability to handle the toughest situations with calm and resolve. "All right, Sheriff," he said. "Whatever you say. I'll keep an eye on things here. You want me to bring Rollins some breakfast?" Hazel nodded. "Yes. And keep a close watch on him. He's unpredictable." Eli left, and Hazel walked towards the cell, her steps heavy. She found Colt awake, sitting on the edge of the cot, staring out the small, barred window at the rising sun. He turned as she approached, his eyes meeting hers. He looked better than he had the previous night. The color had returned to his face, and the pain in his eyes seemed to have lessened. But there was still a weariness about him, a shadow of the life he'd lived. "Morning, Sheriff," he said, his voice quiet. "Morning, Colt," she replied, her voice neutral. She unlocked the cell door and stepped inside, placing a plate of bacon and eggs and a cup of coffee on the table. "Eli brought this," she said. "Eat. You need your strength." He nodded, his gaze fixed on her. "Thank you, Hazel." He began to eat, slowly and deliberately. Hazel watched him, her mind racing. She needed to get some answers, to understand what had brought him back to redemption, what his intentions were. "Colt," she said, her voice firm. "We need to talk." He stopped eating, his eyes meeting hers. "I know. You said you'd tell me everything," she reminded him. "You said you'd explain why you left, why you chose this life." He sighed, pushing the plate away. "I did. And I will. But it's not a simple story, Hazel. It involves people, events, things that are still dangerous. Things that could put you in danger. Hazel scoffed. I'm the sheriff, Colt. I deal with danger every day. I'm not afraid. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of admiration and concern. I know you're not afraid, Hazel. That's what worries me. He paused, taking a deep breath. The reason I left it was tied to your father. Hazel's heart skipped a beat. Her father, Jedediah McCall, had been the sheriff of redemption before her. He'd been a legend, a man of unwavering integrity, a man who had dedicated his life to upholding the law. He died 10 years ago, killed in the line of duty, ambushed by a gang of outlaws. What about my father? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Colt hesitated, his gaze dropping to his hands. He was involved in something, Hazel. Something bigger than just redemption. Something that involved powerful people, corrupt officials, a network of betrayal. He looked back to her. The emotion was raw. Your father was getting too close. He was asking too many questions. His voice cracked for only a moment before he steeled himself. They had him killed, Hazel. The gang that ambushed him, that they were hired. Colt's admission was a blade to Hazel's gut, a sudden twist of fate that seemed written in the stars of the harsh desert sky. Her father. Murdered. And now, here was Colt, the man she had once loved, claiming to have the truth, the only truth. The weight of this revelation, of betrayal and lost loyalty, crashed down upon her. Chapter 5. A storm brewing on the horizon. Hazel stared at Colt, her mind reeling from his revelation. Her father. Murdered? Not killed in a random act of outlaw violence as she'd always believed, but deliberately targeted, assassinated? The thought was almost unbearable, a violation of everything she held sacred. Who? She asked, her voice trembling. Who hired them? Who was responsible? Colt hesitated, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and apprehension. I can't tell you everything, Hazel.
Not yet.
It's too dangerous. For you, for me, for everyone involved. Dangerous? She repeated, her voice rising. My father is dead, Colt. Murdered. And you're telling me it's too dangerous to tell me who did it? I know it's hard to understand, he said, his voice pleading. But trust me, Hazel. I'm trying to protect you. The people who killed your father, they're still out there. They're powerful, ruthless. They won't hesitate to silence anyone who threatens them. And you think I'm just going to sit here and do nothing? She demanded. You think I'm going to let my father's murderers go free?
No, he said.
But you need to be careful. You need to be smart. You can't just go charging in, guns blazing. You need a plan. You need allies. Allies?
She scoffed.
Like who? You? He looked at her, his gaze unwavering. Yes, Hazel. Like me. I know these people. I know how they operate. I can help you bring them to justice. But you need to trust me. Trust him. The words hung in the air, heavy with irony. Trust the man who had betrayed her, the man who had ridden with outlaws, the man who had broken her heart. Could she do it? Could she put aside her past grievances, her doubts, her fears, and trust him to help her avenge her father's death? The silence stretched, punctuated only by the distant sounds of the town slowly awakening. Hazel struggled with her conflicting emotions, her sense of duty warring with her lingering feelings for Colt, her desire for justice battling with her instinct for self-preservation. Suddenly, a loud crash from outside broke the tension. Hazel's hand instinctively went to her gun, her senses on high alert. What was that? Colt asked, his voice sharp. Hazel moved to the window, cautiously peering out. She saw a group of men on horseback, riding hard towards the office. They were heavily armed, their faces grim, their intentions clearly hostile.
Trouble, she said, her voice grim.
And I think it's here for you, Colt. He stood up, his eyes narrowing. The Blackwoods? He asked. Hazel shook her head.
No.
These men, they're different. More professional. As the riders drew closer, Hazel recognized one of them. It was Sheriff Buckley from the neighboring county, a man known for his ruthlessness and his questionable methods. He was accompanied by several deputies, all heavily armed, and a few men Hazel didn't recognize, men who had the look of hired guns, of men who killed for a living. "Buckley," Hazel muttered. "What the hell is he doing here?" Colt's expression darkened. "He's not here for me, Hazel," he said, his voice low and urgent. "He's here for you. He's part of it. Part of the network that killed your father." Hazel's blood ran cold. Buckley? Corrupt? Involved in her father's murder? The thought was sickening, a betrayal of everything she believed in. The riders reined in their horses outside the office, kicking up a cloud of dust. Buckley dismounted, his movements slow and deliberate, his eyes cold and calculating. He approached the door, his hand resting on the butt of his gun. "Sheriff McCall," he called out, his voice booming. "We need to talk." Hazel exchanged a look with Colt. His eyes were filled with a warning, a plea for caution. She knew he was right. This was a trap, a carefully orchestrated maneuver to silence her, to prevent her from uncovering the truth about her father's death. She took a deep breath, steeling herself. She was the sheriff of redemption, and she wouldn't be intimidated. She wouldn't back down. She would face this threat, whatever the cost. "I'm coming out, Buckley," she said, her voice firm and clear. "But my prisoner stays put." She stepped out of the office, her hand resting on her gun, her eyes fixed on Buckley's. The air crackled with tension, the silence broken only by the snorting of horses and the creak of leather. A storm was brewing on the horizon, a storm of violence and betrayal, and Hazel McCall stood at its epicenter, ready to fight for justice, for her father's memory, and for the truth that Colt Rollins held, a truth that could cost them both their lives. The wind picked up, swirling the dust around them like a shroud, a premonition of the darkness that was about to descend. Chapter 6. Echoes of Gunfire and Regret. The midday sun beat down on Redemption, turning the dusty street into a shimmering mirage. Hazel stood face to face with Sheriff Buckley, the tension between them as thick as the desert air. His deputies, a motley crew of hard-faced men, flanked him, their hands hovering near their weapons. The other men, the hired guns, remained on horseback, their eyes cold and watchful, their presence a silent threat. "Buckley," Hazel said, her voice steady, betraying none of the apprehension she felt. "What brings you to my town?" Buckley's lips curled into a sneer. "You know damn well why I'm here, McCall. I'm here for the prisoner. Colt Rollins." "Rollins is my prisoner," Hazel said, her hand tightening on her gun. "He's under my jurisdiction." "Not anymore," Buckley said. "I have a warrant for his arrest. Charges from my county. Robbery, assault, resisting arrest, the list goes on." Hazel knew it was a lie. Buckley's sudden interest in Colt was too convenient, too perfectly timed. Colt's words echoed in her mind. "He's part of it. Part of the network that killed your father." "I haven't seen any warrant," Hazel said, her voice challenging. Buckley chuckled, a low, guttural sound. "Don't play coy with me, McCall. You know how things work. We can do this the easy way, or the hard way. It's your choice." "The easy way being you handing over a man who has information about my father's murder?" Hazel asked, her voice laced with sarcasm. "I don't think so." Buckley's eyes narrowed. "Your father's death was a tragedy, McCall. But it has nothing to do with Rollins. He's a common criminal, and he'll face justice in my county." "I'll be the judge of that," Hazel said. The tension ratcheted up a notch. Buckley's deputies shifted their stances, their hands moving closer to their guns. The hired guns on horseback remained motionless, their eyes like those of predators, waiting for the signal to strike. "Don't be a fool, McCall," Buckley said, his voice hardening. "You're outnumbered, outgunned. You can't win this." "Maybe not," Hazel said. "But I won't stand by and watch you take a man who might hold the key to my father's murder. I won't let you silence him." She knew she was playing a dangerous game, pushing Buckley to the brink. But she had no choice. She couldn't back down. Not now, not when she was so close to the truth. Suddenly, a shot rang out, shattering the tense silence. One of Buckley's deputies slumped to the ground, a bullet hole in his chest. Chaos erupted. Hazel dove for cover behind a water trough, her gun drawn. Gunfire exploded from all directions, bullets whizzing through the air, kicking up dust and splintering wood. The street became a maelstrom of violence, a chaotic ballet of death and destruction. Hazel returned fire, her shots precise and deadly. She saw one of the hired guns go down, his horse rearing in panic. She saw another deputy fall, clutching his leg. But Buckley and the remaining men were still standing, their guns blazing. Hazel knew she was losing. She was pinned down, outnumbered, outgunned. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the jailhouse door.
Colt.
He was unarmed, but he moved with a swiftness and agility that belied his recent injury. He ran towards the fray, drawing the fire of Buckley's men.
Colt, no.
Hazel shouted, her voice lost in the din of gunfire. He ignored her, his eyes fixed on Buckley. He tackled the corrupt sheriff, knocking him to the ground. The two men grappled in the dust, a desperate struggle for survival. Hazel seized the opportunity. She rose from her cover, firing at the remaining deputies, forcing them to retreat. The hired guns, seeing their advantage slipping away, turned their horses and fled, disappearing down the street in a cloud of dust. The gunfire ceased, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Hazel cautiously approached the wrestling figures in the street. Colt had managed to overpower Buckley, pinning him to the ground, his hands around the corrupt sheriff's throat.
Colt, stop.
Hazel yelled. Don't kill him. He looked up at her, his eyes filled with rage, his face contorted with fury. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving. He deserves to die, Hazel, he growled. He's responsible for your father's death. For everything. I know, Hazel said, her voice pleading. But we need him alive. He can tell us who else was involved. He can lead us to the truth. Colt hesitated, his grip on Buckley's throat loosening slightly. He looked at Hazel, his eyes searching hers. He saw the pain, the grief, the unwavering determination in her gaze. Slowly, he released Buckley, letting him slump to the ground, gasping for air. Colt stood up, his body trembling with exhaustion and the aftershocks of adrenaline. The silence returned, heavier now, filled with the echoes of gunfire and regret. Hazel looked at Colt, her heart aching with a mixture of gratitude and fear. He'd risked his life to save her, to protect her, but in doing so, he'd also confirmed her worst fears. He was deeply involved in this, in the web of corruption and betrayal that had claimed her father's life. And she knew that their journey to uncover the truth had only just begun, a journey fraught with danger, a journey that could cost them everything. The dust began to settle, revealing the carnage, the bodies, the shattered remnants of a life Hazel had tried so hard to protect. And in the midst of it all, stood Colt, a figure both heroic and tragic, a man she both loved and feared. Chapter 7. The Dance of Defiance and Desire. The aftermath of the shootout left redemption reeling. The bodies were removed, the wounded tended to, the street cleaned of the debris of battle. But the air remained heavy with tension, with the unspoken questions that hung like a shroud over the town. Hazel had Buckley locked up in one of the cells, his face bruised and swollen, his spirit seemingly broken. He refused to talk, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and defiance. Colt was back in his cell, his wound reopened from the fight, but he refused Hazel's offer to tend to it again. I'll be fine, he said, his voice gruff. It's just a scratch. Hazel knew it was more than a scratch, but she didn't argue. She sensed a distance between them, a wall that had gone up again, a barrier erected by the violence they'd just experienced and the secrets that still lay between them. She spent the rest of the day trying to restore order, reassuring the frightened townsfolk, dealing with the aftermath of the shootout. Eli, shaken but unharmed, helped her as best he could, his youthful idealism tempered by the harsh reality of what he'd witnessed. As evening approached, Hazel found herself drawn back to the jailhouse. She stood outside Colt's cell, watching him through the bars. He was sitting on the cot, his head in his hands, his body slumped with exhaustion. She unlocked the door and stepped inside, the metallic clang echoing in the silence. He didn't look up, didn't acknowledge her presence.
Colt, she said softly.
He slowly raised his head, his eyes meeting hers. They were filled with a weariness that went beyond physical fatigue, a deep-seated sorrow that mirrored her own. "You saved my life," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you," he shrugged, his gaze dropping to the floor. "You would have done the same for me." "Maybe," she said. "But that doesn't change the fact that you risked your life for me." Again. He looked up at her, his eyes searching hers. "I told you, Hazel. I'm not going to let them hurt you." "But why, Colt?" she asked, her voice pleading. "Why are you doing this? After everything, after all the years, after all the pain, why?" He sighed, running a hand through his matted hair. "Because I still care about you, Hazel. More than you know." His words, spoken with a quiet intensity, sent a shiver through her. Despite everything, despite the betrayal, the anger, the resentment, she couldn't deny the truth of his words. She still cared about him, too. The feelings she'd tried so hard to bury, to suppress, were still there, simmering beneath the surface, threatening to erupt. "I don't understand," she said, her voice trembling. "How can you care about me and still be involved in all of this? In my father's murder?" He closed his eyes for a moment, his face etched with pain. "It's complicated, Hazel. I told you. I was trying to protect you. To protect your father. But I failed." "Failed?" she repeated, her voice rising. "You were working with the very people who killed him." "No," he said, his voice urgent. "Not with them. Against them. I was undercover, Hazel, trying to gather evidence, to expose them. But I got in too deep. I lost control." His words, shocking and unexpected, left her reeling. Undercover? He'd been working against the outlaws, against the corrupt officials, all along? It was almost too much to believe. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, her voice filled with a mixture of anger and confusion. "Why didn't you trust me?" "I couldn't," he said. "It was too dangerous. I didn't want to put you at risk. I thought it was better if you didn't know." "Better?" she repeated, her voice laced with bitterness. "You left me, Colt. You broke my heart. You let me believe you were a criminal, an outlaw. And you think that was better?" He looked at her, his eyes filled with regret. "I know I hurt you, Hazel. And I'm so sorry. I never meant to cause you pain. I didn't know what else to do." The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken emotions. Hazel struggled to reconcile the man before her, the man who claimed to have been working undercover, with the man she believed him to be, the man who had betrayed her. She wanted to believe him, to trust him. But the years of hurt, of anger, of resentment, were a barrier she couldn't easily overcome. And the knowledge that he was still withholding information, that there were still secrets between them, made it even harder. She took a step closer to him, her eyes searching his. "Tell me everything, Colt," she said, her voice firm. "Tell me the whole truth. No more lies, no more secrets. Tell me who killed my father and why." He hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I can't tell you everything, Hazel. Not yet. It's still too dangerous. But I can tell you this: your father was investigating a smuggling ring. Gold, weapons, illegal goods being transported across the territory. He was getting close to uncovering the people behind it, the powerful men who were profiting from it. And Buckley was one of them?"
Hazel asked.
Colt nodded.
"Yes."
"But he was just a pawn. A small player. There are others, higher up, much more powerful." "Who?" Hazel pressed. "Tell me their names." He shook his head. "I can't. Not yet. I need proof. Evidence that will stand up in court. Evidence that will bring them down. Once and for all." He looked up. Meeting her gaze, he said, "And I need your help, Hazel. Will you be with me?" The question lingered. It was a dance of conflicting emotions, old desires reignited by a burning need for revenge and justice. Chapter 8. Scars That Never Healed. Hazel stared at Colt, his plea echoing in the small, confined space. "And I need your help, Hazel. Will you be with me?" The question was loaded, layered with years of unspoken feelings, of betrayal and longing, of shared history and broken trust. Could she help him? Could she stand by his side, knowing the danger, knowing the secrets he still held? She thought of her father, of his unwavering commitment to justice, of his dedication to redemption. She thought of the pain she'd carried for 10 years, the grief, the anger, the unanswered questions. And she thought of Colt, the man he'd become, the man who had risked his life to save her, the man who claimed to have been fighting for the same cause as her father, albeit from the shadows. "I don't know, Colt," she said, her voice trembling. "I want to believe you, I really do. But it's hard. You've hurt me, betrayed me. You've kept secrets from me. How can I trust you now?" He looked at her, his eyes filled with a vulnerability she hadn't seen in years. "I know I've made mistakes, Hazel. Terrible mistakes. And I'm not asking you to forget them. I'm just asking you to give me a chance. A chance to prove myself. A chance to make things right. And what if I get hurt?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if I end up like my father?" "I won't let that happen," he said, his voice firm. "I swear to you, Hazel. I'll protect you. I'll do whatever it takes to keep you safe." His words, spoken with such conviction, sent a shiver through her. She saw the sincerity in his eyes, the determination, the desperation. And she saw something else, something that made her heart ache with a longing she'd tried so hard to suppress. She saw the love he still felt for her, a love that had somehow survived the years, the betrayal, the pain. But love wasn't enough. Not anymore. She needed more than words, more than promises. She needed proof. She needed action. She needed to know that she could rely on him, that he wouldn't disappear again, that he wouldn't leave her with a broken heart and a pile of unanswered questions. "Show me," she said, her voice challenging. "Show me that I can trust you. Show me that you're not the man you used to be. Show me that you're worthy of my help." He nodded, his gaze unwavering. "I will, Hazel. I promise you I will." He reached out, his hand hovering over hers, but he didn't touch her. It was a gesture of respect, of understanding, a recognition of the distance that still existed between them. "There's something I need to tell you," he said, his voice low. "Something about the night your father died." Hazel's breath caught in her throat. This was it, the moment of truth. The moment she'd been waiting for, dreading, for 10 long years. "I was there, Hazel," he said, his voice barely audible. "I saw it happen." Hazel's heart pounded in her chest, a frantic drumbeat against the sudden, suffocating silence. She felt a wave of nausea, a cold dread that spread through her veins. "You saw it?" she repeated, her voice trembling. He nodded, his eyes filled with a pain that mirrored her own. I was supposed to meet your father that night. We were going to exchange information. But I was late. I got there just as it happened." He closed his eyes for a moment, his face contorted with anguish. "I saw the ambush, Hazel. I saw them kill him. I tried to stop them, but it was too late." He opened his eyes, his gaze locking onto hers. "I'm so sorry, Hazel. I should have been there sooner. I should have saved him." His words, raw and filled with self-recrimination, struck Hazel like a physical blow. She felt the tears welling up in her eyes, blurring her vision. She saw the pain, the grief, the guilt that consumed him. And she saw something else, something that finally broke through the wall she'd built around her heart. She saw his remorse, his genuine, heartfelt sorrow for the role he'd played, however unintentional, in her father's death. She reached out, her hand covering his. This time, he didn't pull away. He held her gaze, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and hope. "It wasn't your fault, Colt," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "You couldn't have known. You couldn't have stopped them. But I should have," he insisted, his voice thick with guilt. "No," she said, her voice firmer now. "You did what you could. And now we're going to finish what my father started. Together." The word together hung in the air, a fragile promise, a tentative step towards reconciliation, a shared commitment to justice. The scars of the past, the wounds of betrayal, they would never fully heal. But in that moment, In the dimly lit cell, surrounded by the ghosts of their shared history, Hazel and Colt found a common purpose, a reason to fight, a reason to trust, a reason to hope. The weight of their past remained, but it was a weight they would carry together, a burden shared, a challenge to be overcome, as they embarked on a perilous journey to uncover the truth and bring her father's murderers to justice. The night was far from over, but for the first time in a long time, Hazel felt a flicker of light, a glimmer of hope, in the darkness that surrounded them. Chapter 9. Under the watchful desert moon. The decision made, a fragile alliance forged, Hazel and Colt spent the remaining hours of the night discussing their plan. They spoke in hushed tones, their voices barely audible above the quiet sounds of the sleeping town. The cell felt less like a prison and more like a war room, a sanctuary where they could strategize, plot, and prepare for the battle ahead. Colt revealed more details about the smuggling ring, about the network of corruption that extended far beyond redemption, reaching into the highest levels of territorial government. He named names, described operations, outlined connections information he'd gathered during his years undercover, information that was both valuable and incredibly dangerous. Hazel listened intently, her mind absorbing the details, her legal instincts kicking in. She asked questions, probed for weaknesses, identified potential witnesses, outlined the legal framework they would need to follow to bring these criminals to justice. They worked together seamlessly, their individual strengths complementing each other. Colt's knowledge of the underworld, his understanding of the criminal mind, his ability to navigate the treacherous landscape of the frontier, combined with Hazel's legal expertise, her unwavering commitment to justice, her sharp intellect, created a formidable force. But beneath the surface of their collaboration, there was an undercurrent of tension, a reminder of the unspoken emotions that still simmered between them. The years of hurt, of betrayal, of longing, couldn't be erased overnight. There were moments of awkward silence, of averted gazes, of hesitant touches, reminders of the past, of the love they'd once shared, of the pain they'd inflicted on each other. As the first rays of dawn crept over the horizon, painting the sky in hues of pale pink and gold, they finalized their plan. They would leave redemption under the cover of darkness, heading towards Silver Creek, where the circuit judge was scheduled to arrive. They would gather evidence, recruit allies, and prepare to expose the smuggling ring and bring her father's murderers to justice. "It's a long shot," Hazel, Colt said, his voice weary. "We're up against powerful people, ruthless men. They won't hesitate to kill us if they find out what we're up to." "I know," Hazel said, her voice firm. "But we have to try. We owe it to my father. We owe it to ourselves." He looked at her, his eyes filled with admiration. "You're a brave woman, Hazel McCall. And you're a resourceful man, Colt Rollins," she replied, a faint smile playing on her lips. They shared a moment of quiet understanding, a recognition of the challenges ahead, a shared commitment to face them together. The fear was still there, the uncertainty, the doubt. But there was also a sense of purpose, a sense of determination, a sense of hope. Hazel left the cell, leaving Colt to rest. She had preparations to make, supplies to gather, arrangements to finalize. She needed to leave redemption in capable hands to ensure that the town would be safe in her absence. She went to Eli, waking him from a fitful sleep. She explained the situation, omitting some of the more dangerous details, focusing on the need for secrecy and discretion. "I'm leaving town for a few days, Eli," she said. "I'm going after the men who killed my father. I need you to hold down the fort to keep things running smoothly. Can I count on you?" Eli, still groggy from sleep, looked at her with a mixture of surprise and concern. "Of course, Sheriff. You can always count on me. But are you sure about this?" "It sounds dangerous." "It is dangerous," Eli, Hazel said. "But it's something I have to do. And I'm not going alone." She didn't elaborate, didn't mention Colt's name. She didn't want to put Eli in a difficult position, to force him to choose between his loyalty to her and his duty to the law. Eli nodded, his expression resolute. "I understand, Sheriff. I'll do my best. Just be careful." "I will," Hazel said. "And you too." She spent the rest of the day making preparations, quietly, discreetly. She gathered supplies: food, water, ammunition, medical supplies. She packed a saddlebag, her rifle, her Colt peacemaker. She wrote a letter to the territorial governor, outlining her suspicions, requesting assistance, leaving it with Eli to deliver only if she didn't return within a week. As darkness fell, she returned to the jailhouse. Colt was awake, dressed in clean clothes she'd provided, his saddlebag packed and ready. He looked stronger, more determined, the weariness in his eyes replaced by a flicker of anticipation. They left redemption under the cover of night, riding silently through the deserted streets, their shadows blending with the darkness. The moon, a sliver of silver in the vast, star-studded sky, cast a pale light on their path, guiding them towards their uncertain future. As they rode, Hazel felt a mixture of fear and excitement, of apprehension and determination. She was leaving behind everything she knew, everything she'd built, everything she'd fought to protect. She was venturing into the unknown, into a world of danger and betrayal, with a man she wasn't sure she could trust, a man who held her heart in his hands. But she was also riding towards justice, towards closure, towards the truth about her father's death. And she was riding with Colt, the man she'd once loved, the man who had betrayed her, the man who was now her unlikely ally, her partner in this perilous quest. The desert stretched before them, vast and unforgiving, a landscape of shadows and secrets, of hidden dangers and untold possibilities. The wind whispered through the sagebrush, carrying the scent of dust and distant rain, a promise of both hardship and hope. Under the watchful desert moon, Hazel and Colt rode on, their destinies intertwined, their fates uncertain, their hearts bound by a shared past and a dangerous, uncertain future. The silence between them was no longer awkward, but companionable, a shared understanding of the journey ahead, a silent promise to face whatever came their way, together. Chapter 10. The unspoken truths between them. The journey to Silver Creek was arduous, a test of endurance and resilience. They rode for days, traversing rugged terrain, navigating treacherous canyons, enduring the scorching heat of the day and the chilling cold of the desert nights. They spoke sparingly, conserving their energy, their focus on the task ahead. But the silence between them was not empty. It was filled with unspoken thoughts, with unacknowledged emotions, with the weight of their shared past and the uncertainty of their future. They were constantly aware of each other, their movements synchronized, their senses attuned to any sign of danger. They shared meals, simple fare of jerky, hardtack biscuits, and dried fruit, eaten in silence under the vast, star-studded sky. They took turns keeping watch, their eyes scanning the horizon, their ears alert to any unusual sound. They slept under the open sky, wrapped in their blankets, their bodies close but not touching, a silent acknowledgement of the boundaries that still existed between them. As they rode, Hazel observed Colt, studying him, searching for clues to his true nature, to his motivations. She saw the lines of weariness etched on his face, the scars that marked his body, the haunted look in his eyes. She saw the remnants of the boy she'd once loved, the boy who had been full of laughter and charm, the boy who had stolen her heart. But she also saw the man he'd become, the hardened outlaw, the skilled gunslinger, the man who had lived a life of violence and deception. She saw the strength, the resilience, the determination, the unwavering focus. And she saw the vulnerability, the pain, the regret, the longing for redemption. One evening, as they sat around a small campfire, sharing a meager meal, Colt spoke, breaking the silence that had stretched between them for hours. "I know you're still wondering, Hazel," he said, his voice low. "Wondering if you can trust me." Hazel looked at him, her eyes meeting his. "It's not easy, Colt. You've given me plenty of reasons not to." He nodded, his gaze dropping to the flames. "I know. And I don't blame you. I betrayed you. I hurt you. I broke your trust.
And I'm so sorry."
His words, spoken with such sincerity, touched her. She saw the pain in his eyes, the genuine remorse. "Why, Colt?" She asked, her voice softer now. Why did you do it? Why did you leave? Why did you choose that life? He sighed, running a hand through his hair. It's a long story, Hazel.
And it's not pretty.
I have time, she said. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. He saw the understanding, the compassion, the willingness to listen. And he knew he couldn't keep the truth from her any longer. He began to speak, his voice low and hesitant at first, then gaining strength as he delved into his past. He told her about his childhood, about growing up in poverty, about his father's gambling debts, about the threats and violence that had shadowed his early life. He told her about how he'd fallen in with the wrong crowd, about how he'd been drawn into a life of crime, about how he'd become entangled in the smuggling ring. He told her about his first meeting with her father, about how Jedediah McCall had seen something in him, something worth saving. He told her about how her father had offered him a chance to escape that life, to turn his back on the outlaws, to become an informant, to help bring down the very people he'd been working with. Your father, he believed in me. Hazel, Colt said, his voice choked with emotion. He saw something in me that I didn't even see in myself. He gave me a chance to be better, to do something good. And I took it. He told her about his years undercover, about the risks he'd taken, the dangers he'd faced, the sacrifices he'd made. He told her about how he'd gathered evidence, about how he'd passed information to her father, about how they'd worked together, secretly, to expose the smuggling ring.
I wanted to tell you, Hazel, he said.
I wanted to share it with you, but your father made me promise not to. He said it was too dangerous. He said he didn't want to put you at risk. He said he wanted to protect you. Hazel listened in silence, her heart aching with a mixture of grief, anger, and understanding. She finally understood the truth, the whole truth, about Colt's past, about his actions, about his motivations. She understood the sacrifices he'd made, the risks he'd taken, the pain he'd endured. I'm sorry, Hazel, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm so sorry for everything. For leaving, for hurting you, for not being there for your father. Tears welled up in Hazel's eyes, blurring her vision. She reached out, her hand covering his. It's okay, Colt, she said, her voice choked with emotion. It sits in the past. We can't change what happened, but we can move forward. Together. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and hope. The unspoken truths between them had finally been revealed, the barriers broken down, the wounds exposed. And in that moment, under the watchful desert moon, a new connection was forged, a deeper understanding, a renewed sense of trust, a fragile but powerful bond that would guide them through the challenges ahead. The silence that followed was no longer filled with tension, but with a quiet intimacy, a shared grief, a shared purpose, a shared love, rekindled from the ashes of their past. Chapter 11. A bargain struck in the dead of night. The remaining days of their journey to Silver Creek were marked by a newfound closeness, a sense of shared purpose that transcended their past grievances. The unspoken truths had been revealed, the wounds exposed, and a fragile but powerful bond had been forged between Hazel and Colt. They rode together, worked together, planned together, their individual strengths complementing each other, their shared history a constant reminder of the stakes involved. They reached the outskirts of Silver Creek under the cover of darkness, choosing to avoid the main road, opting instead for a less traveled path that wound through the hills overlooking the town. They found a secluded spot, a small, hidden canyon, where they could make camp and observe the town without being seen. Silver Creek was a bustling frontier town, larger and more prosperous than Redemption. It was a hub for trade, a crossroads for travelers, a place where fortunes were made and lost, where law and order were often tenuous, where corruption thrived. The circuit judge, Judge Thompson, was scheduled to arrive the following day, bringing with him a temporary sense of justice, a fleeting hope for those seeking redress. Hazel and Colt knew that Judge Thompson was their key to exposing the smuggling ring, to bringing her father's murderers to justice. But they also knew that they were walking into a dangerous situation, that the men they were after were powerful and ruthless, that they would stop at nothing to protect their interests. As they sat around a small, carefully concealed campfire, eating a simple meal of jerky and dried fruit, they discussed their plan. "We need to be careful," Hazel, Colt said, his voice low. "We can't just walk into town and accuse Buckley and the others without proof. We need evidence, witnesses, something that will convince Judge Thompson to act." "I know," Hazel said. "And we need to be discreet. We can't let them know we're here, that we're onto them." "I have a few contacts in Silver Creek," Colt said. "People I trust, people who might be willing to help us. But it's risky. We don't know who we can trust." "We have to take that risk," Hazel said. "We need information. We need allies." They spent the rest of the night refining their plan, discussing potential scenarios, weighing their options. They knew they were playing a dangerous game, that one wrong move could cost them their lives. But they were determined to see it through, to honor her father's memory, to bring his killers to justice. As the first rays of dawn began to paint the sky, Colt made a decision. He would go into Silver Creek alone, under the guise of a drifter, seeking information, making contact with his allies. Hazel would remain hidden, watching over him, ready to intervene if necessary. "It's too dangerous for both of us to go in," Colt said. "If I'm caught, they might try to use me to get to you. I can't let that happen." Hazel knew he was right, but the thought of letting him go alone, of facing the danger without her, filled her with apprehension. "Be careful, Colt," she said, her voice trembling slightly.
"Please."
He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of determination and tenderness. "I will, Hazel. I promise you. I'll be back." He reached out, his hand brushing against hers. It was a brief, fleeting touch, but it sent a shiver through her. A reminder of the feelings that still lingered between them, the love that had somehow survived the years, the betrayal, the pain. He mounted his horse, a dark silhouette against the brightening sky. He looked back at her, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Don't worry, Sheriff," he said, his voice low. "I'm not planning on getting arrested again." And with that, he rode off, disappearing into the shadows, leaving Hazel alone in the hidden canyon, her heart filled with a mixture of fear and hope. As she watched him go, she realized that she had made a bargain, not just with Colt, but with herself. She had agreed to trust him, to work with him, to risk her life for him. And in doing so, she had opened herself up to the possibility of love, of forgiveness, of a future she had thought was lost forever. But she also knew that the road ahead was fraught with danger, that the men they were after were powerful and ruthless, that they would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. She knew that the bargain she had struck, in the dead of night, under the watchful gaze of the desert stars, could cost her everything. But it could also, perhaps, allow justice. The weight was immense. The cost immeasurable. Chapter 12. Riding towards redemption or ruin. Hazel watched from the hidden canyon as Colt rode into Silver Creek, his figure disappearing into the dusty streets of the town. She felt a knot of anxiety in her stomach, a sense of foreboding that she couldn't shake. She knew the risks, the dangers, the potential for disaster. But she also knew that she had to trust Colt, that she had to believe in their plan, that she had to have faith in their ability to succeed. She spent the day in the canyon, keeping watch over the town, her eyes scanning the streets, the buildings, the people, searching for any sign of Colt, any indication of trouble. She ate sparingly, conserving her supplies, her mind focused on the task ahead. She cleaned her rifle, her Colt peacemaker, her hands moving mechanically, her thoughts racing. As the afternoon wore on, she saw the arrival of the stagecoach, carrying Judge Thompson and his entourage. The town buzzed with activity, people gathering in the streets, eager to witness the arrival of the circuit judge, to seek justice, to air their grievances. Hazel knew that Judge Thompson was their key, their only hope of exposing the smuggling ring and bringing her father's murderers to justice. But she also knew that he was a man of the law, a stickler for procedure, a man who would demand evidence, proof, before he would act. She waited, her patience wearing thin, her anxiety growing with each passing hour. She saw no sign of Colt, no indication of his progress, no message from his contacts. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the town, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. Finally, as darkness fell, she saw him. He emerged from a saloon, his movements cautious, his eyes scanning the streets. He was accompanied by another man, a tall, wiry figure with a weathered face and a knowing look in his eyes. Hazel recognized the man. It was Jedediah Stone, an old friend of her father's, a former lawman who had retired from the force years ago, a man known for his integrity, his honesty, his unwavering commitment to justice. She felt a surge of relief, a sense of hope. If anyone could help them, it was Jedediah Stone. She watched as Colt and Jedediah made their way towards the edge of town, heading in the direction of the hidden canyon. She waited, her heart pounding, her rifle at the ready. As they approached, she stepped out of the shadows, her gun leveled. "Colt," she said, her voice firm. He stopped, his hand going to his gun, but he quickly recognized her. "Hazel," he said, his voice relieved. "It's me." He introduced Jedediah Stone, explaining their plan. Jedediah had agreed to help them, to provide them with information, to connect them with other potential allies, to assist them in gathering evidence against the smuggling ring. "Your father was a good man, Hazel," Jedediah said, his voice gruff.
He was a true lawman.
"I'm honored to help you avenge his death." They spent the night in the canyon, discussing their strategy, sharing information, planning their next move. Jedediah revealed that the smuggling ring was even more extensive than they had imagined, that it involved not only local officials, but also prominent businessmen, wealthy landowners, and even some members of the territorial government. "It's a tangled web, Hazel," Jedediah said. "And it's going to be dangerous to unravel. These men are powerful, ruthless. They won't hesitate to kill anyone who threatens them."
"We know," Hazel said.
"But we're not afraid. We're going to expose them, no matter the cost." They decided that their best course of action was to gather more evidence, to identify witnesses, to build a case that would be irrefutable, a case that would convince Judge Thompson to act. Jedediah would use his contacts within the town to gather information, to identify potential allies, to discreetly spread the word about their investigation. Colt would continue to work undercover, using his knowledge of the underworld to infiltrate the smuggling ring, to gather evidence from the inside. Hazel would remain hidden, coordinating their efforts, providing support, ready to intervene if necessary. They knew that they were riding towards redemption or ruin, that their actions could either bring justice to her father's killers or lead to their own demise. But they were united in their purpose, their determination unwavering, their commitment to each other stronger than ever. As the moon rose high in the sky, casting its pale light on the rugged landscape, they made a pact. They would fight together, they would stand together, they would risk everything to expose the truth and bring the criminals to justice. They would honor her father's memory. They would uphold the law. They would seek redemption, even if it meant facing ruin. The air was thick with tension, with the unspoken knowledge of the dangers ahead, but it was also filled with a sense of purpose, a sense of resolve, a sense of hope. They were a team, a force to be reckoned with, a lawwoman, an outlaw, and a retired lawman, united by a common cause, a shared grief, a burning desire for justice. Chapter 13. The Ghosts of Gold Canyon. The following days were a whirlwind of clandestine meetings, whispered conversations, and dangerous encounters. Jedediah Stone proved to be an invaluable ally. His knowledge of Silver Creek and its inhabitants, his network of contacts, his reputation for integrity, opening doors that would have otherwise remained closed. He introduced Hazel and Colt to a handful of trusted individuals: a disgruntled former deputy, a saloon owner with a conscience, a widow whose husband had been killed by the smuggling ring people who were willing to risk their lives to help them expose the truth. Colt, using his undercover persona, managed to infiltrate the smuggling ring's operations, gaining access to their meetings, their plans, their secrets. He learned that the ring was planning a major shipment of gold, a massive haul that would be transported through Gold Canyon, a treacherous, narrow passage known for its ambushes and its history of violence. The ghosts of Gold Canyon, as the locals called them, were the spirits of those who had died there, victims of outlaws, bandits, and the harsh, unforgiving landscape. It was a place of death, a place of secrets, a place where the past lingered, casting a long, dark shadow over the present. Hazel knew that Gold Canyon was the key, the place where they could expose the smuggling ring, the place where they could confront her father's murderers, the place where they could finally bring them to justice. But it was also the most dangerous place, the place where they could easily lose their lives, the place where their dreams of redemption could turn to ruin. They devised a plan, a daring, risky maneuver that would require perfect timing, flawless execution, and a lot of luck. They would ambush the smugglers in Gold Canyon, intercept the gold shipment, capture the leaders, and present the evidence to Judge Thompson. It was a gamble, a desperate attempt to turn the tables on their enemies, to use the ghosts of Gold Canyon against them. But it was their only chance, their last hope of achieving justice, of honoring her father's memory, of finding peace. As they prepared for their confrontation, Hazel found herself drawn to Colt, her feelings for him growing stronger with each passing day. She saw his courage, his determination, his unwavering commitment to their cause. She saw the pain he carried, the guilt he bore, the longing for redemption that burned within him. And she saw the love he still felt for her, a love that had survived the years, the betrayal, the pain. It was a love that was unspoken, unacknowledged, but it was there, a silent presence between them, a fragile bond that connected them, a source of strength and comfort in the face of danger. One evening, as they sat together, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of fire and gold, Colt spoke, his voice low and hesitant.
"Hazel," he said,
"I know I've made a lot of mistakes. I know I've hurt you, and I don't expect you to forgive me. But I want you to know I never stopped loving you." His words, spoken with such sincerity, such vulnerability, touched her heart. Tears welled up in her eyes, blurring her vision. "I know, Colt," she said, her voice trembling. And I never stopped loving you either." The admission hung in the air, a fragile truth, a whispered confession, a moment of vulnerability in the midst of their perilous journey. They didn't embrace, they didn't kiss, they didn't speak of the future. They simply sat there, together, in silence, acknowledging the love that had endured, the bond that had survived, the hope that still flickered between them. But the moment was fleeting, the reality of their situation quickly intruding. They had a job to do, a mission to accomplish, a battle to fight. They had to focus on the task ahead, on the dangers that awaited them, on the ghosts of Gold Canyon that called to them, beckoning them towards their destiny. They knew that the road ahead was fraught with peril, that their chances of success were slim, that they might not survive the confrontation. But they were ready. They were determined. They were united. They would face the ghosts of Gold Canyon together. They would fight for justice, for her father's memory, for their own redemption. And they would do it, knowing that their love, however fragile, however uncertain, was a source of strength, a beacon of hope, a reason to keep fighting, even in the face of death. The air was thick with anticipation, with the unspoken knowledge that their lives were about to change forever, that the ghosts of Gold Canyon would either claim them or set them free. Chapter 14. Blood on the Badge. The day of the ambush dawned clear and bright, the desert air crisp and cool, the sky a vast expanse of blue. Hazel, Colt, and Jedediah, along with their small band of allies, made their way to Gold Canyon, their hearts pounding with a mixture of anticipation and dread. They knew the risks, the dangers, the potential for disaster. But they were determined to see it through, to honor her father's memory, to bring his killers to justice. They positioned themselves strategically along the narrow canyon walls, hidden among the rocks and boulders, their rifles at the ready. They waited, their senses on high alert, their eyes scanning the canyon floor, their ears listening for any sign of the approaching smugglers. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead, the rustle of the wind through the dry brush, the beating of their own hearts. The tension was palpable, a thick, suffocating presence that hung in the air like a shroud. Finally they heard it, the distant rumble of horses' hooves, the creak of wagon wheels, the muffled voices of men. The smugglers were coming. Hazel's hand tightened on her rifle, her finger resting on the trigger. She exchanged a look with Colt, his eyes filled with a mixture of determination and concern. He nodded, a silent reassurance, a promise to stand by her side, no matter what. The smugglers entered the canyon, a long line of heavily laden wagons, escorted by a dozen or so armed men. They were confident, arrogant, unaware of the trap that awaited them. As the lead wagon reached the narrowest point of the canyon, Hazel gave the signal. A single shot rang out, echoing through the canyon walls. It was the signal to attack. The chaos erupted. Gunfire exploded from all sides, bullets whizzing through the air, kicking up dust and splintering wood. The smugglers, caught completely by surprise, scrambled for cover, returning fire wildly, their initial confidence replaced by panic and confusion. Hazel fired her rifle with deadly accuracy, her shots finding their mark, bringing down one smuggler after another. Colt, fighting alongside her, moved with a swiftness and agility that belied his years, his gun blazing, his aim true. Jedediah, despite his age, fought with the ferocity of a seasoned lawman, his experience and knowledge proving invaluable. The battle raged, a fierce, brutal exchange of gunfire, a chaotic ballet of death and destruction. The canyon floor became littered with bodies, both smugglers and their own allies. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder, of blood, of sweat, of fear. Hazel saw one of her allies, the saloon owner, fall, a bullet through his chest. She saw another, the widow, go down, clutching her leg. She felt a surge of anger, of grief, of determination. She would not let their sacrifices be in vain. She saw Colt, fighting his way towards the lead wagon, where she knew the leader of the smuggling ring, a ruthless man named Bartlett, was hiding. She saw him take a bullet to the shoulder, staggering back, but he kept going, his eyes fixed on his target. Suddenly, she saw Buckley, the corrupt sheriff, emerge from behind one of the wagons, his gun aimed at Colt's back.
"Colt!"
She screamed, her voice lost in the din of gunfire. She fired, her shot hitting Buckley in the arm, knocking his gun aside. But it was too late. Buckley had already fired. Colt crumpled to the ground, his body still, his blood staining the dusty earth. Hazel's heart stopped. She felt a wave of nausea, a cold dread that spread through her veins.
No, it couldn't be. He couldn't be dead.
She ran towards him, ignoring the bullets that whizzed past her, her only thought to reach him, to help him, to save him. She knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she reached for his pulse. She felt it, weak but present. He was alive but barely. "Colt," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion.
"Hold on.
Please hold on." He opened his eyes, his gaze focusing on her. He smiled, a faint, pain-filled smile. "Hazel," he whispered, "I told you I wouldn't get arrested again." His eyes closed, his body going limp. Hazel screamed, a primal scream of grief, of rage, of despair. She cradled his body in her arms, her tears falling onto his blood-stained shirt. The battle continued around her, but she was oblivious to it. Her world had shrunk to the small space occupied by Colt's body, to the sound of his fading heartbeat, to the feel of his warm blood on her hands. Suddenly, she felt a hand on her shoulder. It was Jedediah. "Hazel," he said, his voice gruff but gentle. "We have to go. We can't stay here." She looked up at him, her eyes filled with pain, with grief, with a burning desire for revenge. "They'll pay for this, Jedediah," she said, her voice cold, hard, filled with a deadly determination. "Every single one of them." The battle was lost, but the war had just begun. Hazel's grief was a tempest, threatening to consume her. She cradled Colt, a broken promise, a shattered dream. Her badge, once a symbol of justice, was now stained with the blood of the man she loved. Chapter 15. Crossroads of the Heart. The retreat from Gold Canyon was a blur of pain and grief. Hazel, numb with shock, allowed Jedediah to lead her away, to guide her back to Silver Creek, to the hidden canyon where they had made their camp. She carried Colt's body with them, refusing to leave him behind, her arms aching, her heart shattered. The remaining members of their small band of allies followed, their faces grim, their spirits broken. They had lost the battle, they had lost friends, they had lost hope. They buried Colt in the hidden canyon, under the watchful gaze of the desert moon. Hazel dug the grave herself, her hands raw and bleeding, her tears falling onto the dry earth. She wrapped him in his blanket, his face pale and still, his body lifeless. She placed his hat on his chest, a final farewell, a silent goodbye. She stood over his grave, her body trembling, her heart aching. She spoke to him, her voice choked with emotion, her words a mixture of grief, of love, of regret. "I'm so sorry, Colt," she whispered. "I failed you. I couldn't save you. I should have been there. I should have protected you." She recounted their short time, going from sheriff and outlaw to lovers. She spent the night by his grave, refusing to leave his side. She watched the stars wheel across the sky. The moon cast its pale light on the landscape, the wind whisper through the sagebrush. She felt his presence, his spirit, his love, surrounding her, comforting her, guiding her. As dawn approached, she knew she had to make a decision. She had to choose a path, a direction, a future. She could give up, succumb to her grief, abandon her quest for justice. Or she could fight on, honor Colt's memory, continue their mission, bring his killers to justice. She looked at his grave, at the simple wooden cross that marked his final resting place. She thought of her father, of his unwavering commitment to the law, of his dedication to redemption. She thought of Colt, of his courage, his determination, his sacrifice. She made her decision. She would not give up. She would not surrender. She would fight on in their memory, for their sake, for the sake of justice. She rose, her body stiff and sore, her heart heavy but resolute. She looked at the rising sun, painting the sky in hues of gold and rose. She felt a surge of strength, of determination, of renewed purpose. She went to Jedediah, who was waiting for her, his face etched with concern. "I'm going back to Silver Creek," she said, her voice firm. "I'm going to finish what we started." Jedediah looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of admiration and apprehension. "Are you sure, Hazel? It's dangerous. You'll be alone."
"I'm not alone," she said.
"I have Colt's memory. I have my father's legacy. And I have you, Jedediah. Will you help me?" He nodded, his expression resolute. "Of course, Hazel. I'm with you always." They returned to Silver Creek, their plan changed, their strategy altered. They would no longer seek to ambush the smugglers, to capture them in the act. They would focus on gathering evidence, on exposing their crimes, on bringing them to justice through the legal system. Hazel knew that it would be a long and difficult process, that the odds were stacked against them. But she was determined to see it through, to honor Colt's sacrifice, to avenge her father's death, to uphold the law, to bring peace to her troubled heart. She went to Judge Thompson, presenting him with the evidence they had gathered, the testimonies they had collected, the names they had uncovered. She told him the whole story, from her father's murder to Colt's undercover operation to the ambush in Gold Canyon. Judge Thompson listened intently, his face grim, his eyes filled with a mixture of shock and outrage. He was a man of the law, a stickler for procedure, but he was also a man of integrity, a man of justice. "This is a serious matter, Sheriff McCall," he said. "A very serious matter. If what you say is true, we're dealing with a conspiracy that reaches the highest levels of territorial government." "It is true, Judge," Hazel said. "And I have the evidence to prove it." Judge Thompson agreed to help her, to issue warrants, to convene a grand jury, to bring the criminals to justice. But he warned her that it would be a long and difficult process, that they would face opposition, resistance, even violence. "They won't give up easily, Sheriff McCall," he said. "They have too much to lose. They'll fight back, with every weapon at their disposal." "I know," Hazel said. "But I'm ready. I'm not afraid." She stood at a crossroads, her heart torn between grief and determination, between love and loss, between the past and the future. She had chosen her path, a path of justice, a path of honor, a path of redemption. And she would walk it, alone but not alone, with Colt's memory as her guide, with her father's legacy as her inspiration, with Jedediah's support as her strength. The road ahead was uncertain, the dangers were real, but she was ready to face them, her spirit unbroken, her resolve unwavering, her heart filled with a quiet, fierce determination to see justice done. Chapter 16. The Weight of Unforgiven Sins. The weeks that followed were a relentless pursuit of justice, a slow, grinding process of gathering evidence, building a case, and navigating the treacherous legal landscape. Hazel worked tirelessly, driven by her grief for Colt, her anger at his killers, her unwavering commitment to her father's legacy. She spent countless hours with Judge Thompson and his staff, reviewing documents, interviewing witnesses, preparing for the grand jury hearing. She faced opposition at every turn, from corrupt officials, from powerful businessmen, from hired guns who tried to intimidate her, to silence her, to kill her. But she refused to be deterred. She had come too far, lost too much, to give up now. She had Colt's memory to guide her, her father's legacy to inspire her, Jedediah's support to strengthen her. Jedediah proved to be an invaluable ally, his knowledge of Silver Creek and its inhabitants, his network of contacts, his unwavering loyalty, providing Hazel with the support and assistance she needed. He helped her identify and recruit witnesses. He gathered information. He protected her from harm. He stood by her side, always. The grand jury hearing was a tense and dramatic affair. Hazel presented her evidence, meticulously, painstakingly, laying out the case against the smuggling ring, against Buckley, against Bartlett, against the other corrupt officials who had been involved in her father's murder and Colt's death. The defendants, represented by a team of high-powered lawyers, fought back fiercely, denying the charges, challenging the evidence, attacking Hazel's credibility, attempting to discredit her, to silence her. But Hazel stood firm, her voice unwavering, her testimony clear and compelling. She presented the witnesses, the documents, the physical evidence, the irrefutable proof of their guilt. The grand jury, after days of deliberation, returned a verdict of indictment. The defendants were charged with murder, conspiracy, corruption, a litany of crimes that carried the weight of unforgiven sins. The trial was set, a date chosen, a battleground prepared. Hazel knew that it would be a long and difficult fight, that the defendants would use every means at their disposal to avoid justice, to escape punishment, to silence her forever. But she was ready. She had prepared herself, mentally, emotionally, physically. She had the truth on her side, the law on her side, the memory of Colt and her father on her side. As she prepared for the trial, she found herself thinking more and more about Colt, about their brief time together, about the love they had shared, about the future they had lost. She visited his grave often, talking to him, sharing her thoughts, her fears, her hopes. She felt his presence, his spirit, his love, surrounding her, guiding her, strengthening her. She knew that he was with her, in spirit, in memory, in her heart. One evening, as she sat by his grave, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple, she spoke to him, her voice soft and filled with emotion. "I miss you, Colt," she whispered. "I miss you so much. I wish you were here, with me. I wish we could have had a future together." She paused, her voice choked with tears. "But I know you're watching over me," she continued. "I know you're proud of me. And I'm going to finish this, Colt. For you, for my father, for us." She felt a sense of peace, a sense of closure, a sense of acceptance. She knew that Colt was gone, that she would never see him again, that their love was a memory, a dream, a fleeting moment in time. But she also knew that his love had changed her, had strengthened her, had given her the courage to fight on, to seek justice, to find redemption. And she knew that, in a way, he would always be with her, in her heart, in her memory, in her spirit. The weight of unforgiven sins was heavy, a burden she carried with her, a reminder of the past, of the loss, of the pain. But it was also a source of strength, a motivation to fight on, a reason to seek justice, a path towards healing, towards peace, towards a future where the guilty would be punished, the innocent protected, and the memory of those she had lost would be honored. The trial loomed, a daunting challenge, a final reckoning, but Hazel was ready to face it, her heart filled with a quiet, fierce determination to see justice done, to bring closure to this chapter of her life, to find a measure of peace in the midst of a storm. Chapter 17. A Promise Made Under Fire. The trial of the Silver Creek conspirators was a media sensation, drawing attention from across the territory, the courtroom packed with spectators, journalists, and interested parties. The defendants, Bartlett, Buckley, and a handful of other corrupt officials and businessmen, sat at the defense table, their faces grim, their lawyers whispering furiously, their futures hanging in the balance. Hazel, as the lead witness for the prosecution, took the stand, her heart pounding, her palms sweating, her eyes fixed on the jury. She knew that this was her moment, her chance to tell the truth, to expose the criminals, to bring them to justice. She recounted the events that had led to the trial, from her father's murder 10 years earlier, to Colt's undercover operation, to the ambush in Gold Canyon, to Colt's death. She spoke clearly, calmly, and with conviction, her voice ringing through the courtroom, her words painting a vivid picture of the conspiracy, the corruption, the violence. She presented the evidence, meticulously, painstakingly, laying out the case against the defendants, piece by piece, witness by witness, document by document. She showed the jury the smuggling routes, the financial records, the coded messages, the testimonies of the witnesses they had recruited. The defense lawyers, skilled and ruthless, cross-examined her relentlessly, attacking her credibility, questioning her motives, attempting to discredit her, to confuse the jury, to create doubt. They accused her of being biased, of being motivated by revenge, of being blinded by grief. But Hazel stood firm, her voice unwavering, her testimony unshaken. She answered their questions honestly, directly, and with dignity, refuting their accusations, defending her actions, upholding the truth. She spoke of Colt, of his bravery, his sacrifice, his love for her. She told the jury how he had risked his life to expose the smuggling ring, how he had died trying to protect her, how he had given his life for justice. The courtroom was silent, the spectators captivated by her testimony, the jury listening intently, the defendants shifting uneasily in their seats. The trial lasted for weeks, a grueling ordeal of legal maneuvering, of conflicting testimonies, of dramatic confrontations. Hazel spent every day in the courtroom, fighting for justice, for her father, for Colt, for herself. Jedediah Stone was a constant presence, sitting in the gallery, offering her support, his presence a reminder of their shared purpose, their unwavering commitment to the cause. As the trial neared its end, Hazel felt a mixture of exhaustion and anticipation, of fear and hope. She had done everything she could. She had presented the evidence. She had told the truth. She had fought her heart out. Now it was up to the jury. The closing arguments were powerful and emotional. The prosecution, led by a skilled and dedicated lawyer appointed by Judge Thompson, summarized the case, highlighting the evidence, emphasizing the guilt of the defendants, calling for justice. The defense lawyers, in a last-ditch effort to save their clients, argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that Hazel was unreliable, that the witnesses were untrustworthy, that the jury should acquit. Finally, the case went to the jury. The hours of deliberations stretched into days, the tension in the courtroom palpable, the fate of the defendants, and Hazel's quest for justice hanging in the balance. Hazel waited, her nerves frayed, her body exhausted, her heart filled with a mixture of dread and hope. She visited Colt's grave, talking to him, seeking his guidance, his strength, his comfort. She remembered a promise she had made to him, a promise made under fire, a promise whispered in the heat of battle, a promise that had sustained her through the darkest hours. She had promised him that she would finish what they had started, that she would bring his killers to justice, that she would honor his memory. And now, she was on the verge of fulfilling that promise. Finally, the jury returned. The courtroom was packed, silent, expectant. The foreman stood, his face solemn, his voice clear. "We, the jury," he said, "find the defendants guilty." A collective gasp went through the courtroom, followed by a wave of applause, of cheers, of relief. Hazel felt a surge of emotion, of vindication, of closure. Justice had been served. The defendants were sentenced, Bartlett and Buckley to hang, the others to long prison terms. The smuggling ring was broken, the conspiracy exposed, the corruption rooted out. Hazel left the courtroom, her head held high, her heart filled with a mixture of grief and satisfaction. She had done it. She had fulfilled her promise to Colt. She had avenged her father's death. She had brought his killers to justice. She had honored their memory. She had upheld the law. She had found a measure of peace. But the victory was bittersweet. The cost had been high. The scars would remain. She had lost Colt. She had lost friends. She had lost a part of herself. But she had also gained something invaluable, something enduring. She had found her strength, her courage, her resilience. She had discovered the true meaning of justice, of love, of sacrifice. She had found redemption. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the town, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. Hazel stood on the steps of the courthouse, looking out at the horizon, her heart filled with a quiet, fierce determination to continue her life's work, to uphold the law, to protect the innocent, to honor the memory of those she had lost. She would carry their love with her, always. It had all culminated in this moment. The promise she had made under the duress of gunfire, fulfilled. Chapter 18. The Reckoning at Dawn. The executions of Bartlett and Buckley were scheduled for dawn, a public spectacle meant to serve as a deterrent, a warning to those who would dare to defy the law. Hazel, despite her mixed emotions, felt a sense of obligation to attend, to witness the final act of justice, to ensure that the sentence was carried out. She woke early, the pre-dawn chill seeping into her bones, her heart heavy with the weight of the impending event. She dressed in her sheriff's uniform, the badge feeling heavier than usual, a symbol of both her authority and her loss. She walked to the town square, where the gallows had been erected, a grim reminder of the harsh realities of frontier justice. A crowd had already gathered, a mix of somber onlookers, curious spectators, and those seeking a sense of closure, of retribution. Jedediah Stone stood waiting for her, his face etched with a mixture of sadness and resolve. He had been a steadfast ally, a source of strength and support, a friend in the truest sense of the word. "Are you ready for this, Hazel?" he asked, his voice low. She nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "I have to be, Jedediah. For Colt, for my father, for myself." They took their places near the front of the crowd, their presence a silent testament to their commitment to justice, to their unwavering belief in the law. The prisoners were brought out, their hands bound, their faces pale and drawn. Bartlett, defiant to the end, spat curses and threats, his eyes filled with hatred and rage. Buckley, on the other hand, seemed resigned to his fate, his shoulders slumped, his gaze fixed on the ground. The executioner, a hooded figure with a grim demeanor, prepared the nooses, his movements precise and efficient. The crowd watched in silence, their breaths held, their hearts pounding. Hazel felt a wave of conflicting emotions: grief, anger, sadness, and a strange sense of emptiness. She had sought justice, she had fought for it, she had achieved it. But it didn't bring Colt back. It didn't erase the pain, the loss, the scars. As the nooses were placed around the prisoners' necks, Hazel closed her eyes, unable to watch the final moments. She thought of Colt, of his bravery, his sacrifice, his love. She thought of her father, of his unwavering commitment to justice, of his legacy. She heard the trapdoors spring open, the sickening thud of bodies, the gasp of the crowd. It was over. Justice had been served. She opened her eyes, looking at the lifeless figures hanging from the gallows. It was a gruesome sight, a stark reminder of the price of sin, of the consequences of violence, of the harsh realities of life and death on the frontier. She felt no satisfaction, no sense of triumph, only a profound sadness, a deep weariness, a longing for peace. She turned away from the gallows, walking slowly through the dispersing crowd, her head bowed, her heart heavy. Jedediah walked beside her, his hand resting lightly on her arm, offering silent support, understanding her pain, sharing her grief. "It's over, Hazel," he said softly. "You did what you had to do. You honored their memory. You brought them justice." She nodded, unable to speak, her throat choked with emotion. They reached the edge of town, where the desert stretched out before them, vast and unforgiving, a landscape of beauty and brutality, of life and death, of hope and despair. Hazel stopped, looking out at the horizon, the rising sun painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson. She felt the warmth of the sun on her face, the gentle breeze on her skin, the vastness of the open space surrounding her. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the fresh air, feeling a sense of release, of liberation, of renewal. "What will you do now, Hazel?" Jedediah asked, his voice gentle. She looked at him, a faint smile playing on her lips. "I don't know, Jedediah," she said. "I haven't thought that far ahead. But I think I'll stay in redemption. I think I'll continue to be the sheriff. I think I'll try to make a difference." She paused, her gaze returning to the horizon. "I'll never forget Colt," she said. "Or my father. They'll always be with me, in my heart, in my memory, in my spirit. But I have to move on. I have to live my life. I have to find a way to be happy again." Jedediah nodded, his eyes filled with understanding and compassion. "You will, Hazel," he said. "You're a strong woman. You've been through so much. You deserve to be happy." They stood there for a moment, together, in silence, watching the sunrise, feeling the warmth of the new day, embracing the possibilities of the future. The reckoning at dawn was over, the ghosts of the past laid to rest, the wounds of betrayal and loss beginning to heal. Hazel had faced her demons, she had fought her battles, she had found her justice. And now, she was ready to face the future, whatever it may hold, with courage, with determination, with hope. She was a survivor, a fighter, a lawwoman, a woman who had loved and lost, a woman who had found redemption in the midst of tragedy. And she would continue to live her life, to honor her past, to embrace her future, to make a difference in the world, one day at a time. The desert stretched before her, a blank canvas, ready to be filled with the colors of her new life, a life born from the ashes of loss, a life tempered by the fires of justice, a life filled with the promise of hope. Chapter 19. Shattered Illusions and New Beginnings. Returning to redemption was a bittersweet homecoming for Hazel. The town, once a sanctuary of order and familiarity, now felt haunted by memories, by the ghosts of Colt and her father, by the echoes of violence and loss. The sheriff's office, her domain, her refuge, felt both comforting and suffocating, a reminder of her duty, her responsibility, her past. The townsfolk welcomed her back with a mixture of relief, respect, and a hint of pity. They had heard the news of the trial, of the executions, of Colt's death. They knew she had been through a harrowing ordeal, that she had emerged victorious, but scarred. Eli Johnson, her young deputy, greeted her with a mixture of awkwardness and admiration. He had held down the fort in her absence, keeping the peace, maintaining order, proving himself to be a capable and reliable lawman. "Sheriff McCall," he said, his voice filled with respect. "It's good to have you back. We missed you." Hazel smiled, a genuine smile, the first one in a long time. "It's good to be back, Eli," she said. "You did a good job. I'm proud of you." She spent the first few days readjusting to life in redemption, catching up on local affairs, dealing with minor disputes, re-establishing her authority. She found that the routine, the familiarity of her duties, helped to ease her pain, to distract her from her grief, to ground her in the present. But the nights were difficult. She tossed and turned in her small cot in the back room of the office, haunted by nightmares, by memories of Colt, by the violence she had witnessed, by the loss she had endured. She often found herself walking to the edge of town, to the small cemetery where her father was buried, where she had also buried a few of the townsfolk. Though Colt rested in a hidden canyon, she found talking out loud to her father gave her courage. One evening, as she stood by her father's grave, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple, she heard a voice behind her. "He was a good man, your father." She turned, surprised, and saw a figure standing in the shadows. It was a woman, tall and slender, with weathered features and kind eyes. Hazel didn't recognize her. "I'm sorry," Hazel said. "I don't believe I know you." The woman smiled, a sad smile.
"My name is Sarah," she said.
"Sarah Jenkins. I knew your father. And I knew Colt." Hazel's heart skipped a beat. "You knew Colt?" she asked, her voice hesitant. Sarah nodded.
"Yes.
We were close."
Once."
Hazel felt a pang of jealousy, a flicker of resentment, but she quickly suppressed it. She had no claim on Colt, not anymore. He was gone. "How did you know him?" Hazel asked, her curiosity piqued. Sarah hesitated, her gaze dropping to the ground.
"It's a long story," she said.
"And it's not a happy one." Hazel sensed that there was more to the story, that Sarah was holding something back, that there were secrets yet to be revealed. "I have time," Hazel said, "and I think I deserve to know the truth." Sarah looked at her, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and understanding. "All right," she said. "I'll tell you, but it might change the way you think about Colt." Sarah began to speak, her voice low and hesitant at first, then gaining strength as she delved into her past. She told Hazel about her life in a small mining town, about her encounter with Colt, about their brief but passionate affair. She told Hazel about how Colt had been different then, younger, wilder, more reckless. He had been running with a gang of outlaws, involved in petty crimes, living on the edge. She told Hazel about how she had fallen in love with him, about how she had believed in him, about how she had hoped he would change. "But he didn't," Sarah said, her voice filled with regret. "He couldn't. He was too far gone. He broke my heart, Hazel. He left me, just like he left you." Hazel listened in silence, her heart aching for Sarah, for herself, for the shattered illusions of love and hope. She realized that Colt had been a flawed man, a complex man, a man who had struggled with his demons, a man who had made mistakes, a man who had hurt the people he loved. "But he wasn't all bad, Hazel," Sarah said. "He had a good heart, deep down. He was capable of kindness, of compassion, of love. He couldn't escape his past. He couldn't outrun his demons." Sarah told Hazel about how she had heard about Colt's death, about how she had felt a pang of grief, of regret, of forgiveness. "I don't blame him, Hazel," she said. "I understand him. And I hope he found peace, in the end." Hazel nodded, her eyes filled with tears. She understood, too. She forgave Colt, too. She had seen his good side, his brave side, his loving side. She had seen his remorse, his regret, his longing for redemption. She and Sarah talked for a long time, sharing their memories of Colt, their grief, their forgiveness. They found a strange comfort in each other's company, a shared understanding of the man they had both loved, the man who had touched their lives, the man who was gone. As the night drew to a close, Sarah stood up to leave. "Thank you, Hazel," she said, "for listening, for understanding, for not judging him."
Hazel smiled, a sad smile.
"Thank you, Sarah," she said, "for telling me the truth, for helping me to see him more clearly." Sarah left, disappearing into the shadows, leaving Hazel alone with her thoughts, with her memories, with her grief. But something had changed. The illusions had been shattered, the truth revealed, the past laid bare. Hazel saw Colt more clearly now, not as a hero, not as a villain, but as a man, a flawed, complex human being. And she realized that she could finally let him go. She could forgive him. She could forgive herself. She could move on. The new beginnings were not what she had imagined, not what she had hoped for. But they were real. They were tangible. They were possible. She could rebuild her life. She could find new purpose. She could create a future, not without Colt, but in his memory, in his honor, in his spirit. She was a survivor, A fighter, a lawwoman, a woman who had loved and lost, a woman who had found redemption in the midst of tragedy. And she would continue to live her life, to honor her past, to embrace her future, to make a difference in the world, one day at a time. The shattered illusions were gone, replaced by a clear-eyed view of the past, a resolute acceptance of the present, and a cautious but hopeful embrace of the future. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and horizons. The weeks turned into months, and Hazel settled back into her life in redemption, her routine, her duties, her responsibilities. She found a measure of peace, a sense of purpose, a quiet contentment in her work, in her community, in her solitude. She continued to be the sheriff, upholding the law, protecting the innocent, keeping the peace. She was respected, admired, even loved by the townsfolk. She had earned their trust, their loyalty, their affection. Eli Johnson, her deputy, had grown into a fine young lawman, his skills honed, his confidence bolstered, his loyalty unwavering. He was a valuable asset, a trusted friend, a constant source of support. Hazel often visited Colt's grave in the hidden canyon outside of Silver Creek, making the journey on horseback, spending hours in quiet contemplation, talking to him, sharing her thoughts, her feelings, her hopes. She found a sense of connection with him there, a spiritual bond that transcended death, that defied time and space. She also kept in touch with Jedediah Stone, their friendship strengthened by their shared experiences, their mutual loss, their common purpose. They often visited each other, sharing meals, exchanging stories, offering each other comfort and support. Life went on. The seasons changed, the desert bloomed and withered, the sun rose and set. Hazel found a rhythm, a routine, a sense of normalcy in her life. But she never forgot Colt. His memory lived on, in her heart, in her mind, in her spirit. She carried his love with her, always, a silent presence, a guiding force, a source of strength and comfort. One day, a stranger arrived in Redemption. He was a tall, lean man with weathered features and piercing blue eyes. He rode a magnificent black stallion, his saddlebags packed, his demeanor quiet and reserved. He dismounted in front of the sheriff's office, his spurs clinking on the wooden boardwalk. He looked at the sign above the door, Sheriff Hazel McCall, and a faint smile played on his lips. Hazel emerged from the office, her hand resting on her gun, her eyes assessing the stranger. She didn't recognize him, but there was something familiar about him, something that tugged at her memory, something that stirred a long-dormant emotion. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice firm but polite. The stranger looked at her, his eyes searching hers. "I'm looking for Sheriff McCall," he said, his voice deep and resonant. "I'm Sheriff McCall," Hazel said. The stranger smiled, a genuine smile that lit up his face. "I know," he said. "I've heard a lot about you." He extended his hand, a gesture of friendship, of respect. "My name is Cole," he said. "Cole Rollins." Hazel's heart stopped. Her breath caught in her throat. Her eyes widened in disbelief. Cole Rollins? Colt's brother? He looked so much like Colt, yet different. Older, perhaps. Wiser. Calmer. But the resemblance was undeniable. The same eyes, the same jawline, the same presence. "I don't understand," Hazel stammered, her voice trembling. Colt is dead." Cole nodded, his expression somber. "I know," he said. "I heard."
I'm sorry."
He paused, his gaze dropping to the ground. "I came to pay my respects, to find out what happened, to meet the woman my brother loved." Hazel felt a wave of emotion shock, confusion, grief, and a strange, unexpected flicker of hope. She invited him inside, offering him a cup of coffee, listening to his story. He told her about his life, about his estrangement from Colt, about his regret for not having been there for his brother. He told her that he had heard about the events in Silver Creek, about the trial, about the executions, about Hazel's bravery and determination. "Colt always spoke highly of you when he had the chance to over the few telegrams we were able to exchange," Cole said. "He said you were the strongest, most courageous woman he'd ever met." He said, he loved you. Hazel's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't speak. She simply listened, absorbing his words, feeling his presence, accepting his truth. They talked for hours, sharing stories about Colt, about their lives, about their hopes and dreams. Hazel found a strange comfort in Cole's company, a connection to Colt, a link to the past. As the day drew to a close, Cole stood up to leave. "Thank you, Sheriff McCall," he said.
For everything.
For taking care of my brother. For loving him." Hazel nodded, her voice choked with emotion. "Thank you, Cole," she said. "For coming. For telling me about him." He hesitated, his gaze lingering on her. I'd like to stay in touch," he said. "If that's all right with you." Hazel smiled, a genuine smile, a smile that reached her eyes. "I'd like that very much," she said. He mounted his horse, a tall, lean figure against the setting sun. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and hope. "Goodbye, Sheriff McCall," he said. "Goodbye, Cole," she said. He rode off, disappearing into the shadows, leaving Hazel alone with her thoughts, with her memories, with her future. The final confrontation of hearts and horizons had come and gone. The past had been revisited, the truth revealed, the wounds reopened and healed. Hazel had faced her demons, she had found her peace, she had embraced her destiny. And now, she was ready for a new beginning, a new chapter, a new love. The desert stretched before her, a vast and open space, filled with possibilities, with promise, with hope. She was a survivor, a fighter, a lawwoman, a woman who had loved and lost, a woman who had found redemption in the midst of tragedy. And she would continue to live her life, to honor her past, to embrace her future, to make a difference in the world, one day at a time. The horizon beckoned, not as a boundary, but as an invitation, a promise of new adventures, new challenges, new love. Epilogue. Years passed, and the dust settled on the memories of Silver Creek and Gold Canyon. Redemption, under Sheriff Hazel McCall's watchful eye, continued to thrive, a beacon of law and order in the vast, untamed territory. Hazel and Cole Rollins kept their promise. They stayed in touch, their initial connection deepening into a bond of friendship, of respect, of love. They wrote letters, exchanged visits, shared stories, and slowly, gradually, built a life together. Cole, unlike his brother, was a man of peace, a man of stability, a man of home. He had inherited his father's ranch, a sprawling property in a neighboring territory, and he invited Hazel to join him there. She hesitated at first, her loyalty to redemption, her commitment to her duties, holding her back. But she also knew that she deserved happiness, that she deserved a life beyond the badge, beyond the grief, beyond the memories. She made the decision, a difficult one, but the right one. She resigned as sheriff, passing the torch to Eli Johnson, who had proven himself to be a worthy successor, a capable lawman, a trusted friend. The townsfolk, though saddened by her departure, understood her decision, respected her choice, wished her well. They threw her a farewell party, a celebration of her service, her courage, her dedication. Hazel left redemption with a mix of sadness and anticipation, of regret and hope. She was leaving behind a part of herself, a chapter of her life, a town she had loved and protected. But she was also embracing a new beginning, a new adventure, a new love. She joined Cole at his ranch, a beautiful, sprawling property nestled in a valley surrounded by rolling hills and towering mountains. It was a peaceful place, a tranquil place, a place of home. She and Cole built a life together, a life filled with love, with laughter, with shared experiences. They worked the ranch, they rode horses, they explored the countryside, they built a family. They never forgot Colt. They spoke of him often, sharing memories, honoring his legacy, keeping his spirit alive. They visited his grave in the hidden canyon, together, placing flowers on his resting place, remembering his bravery, his sacrifice, his love. Hazel found happiness, a deep, abiding, fulfilling happiness. She had found her peace, her redemption, her love. She had faced her demons, She had overcome her challenges. She had embraced her destiny. She was no longer just the sheriff, the lawwoman, the survivor. She was a wife, a partner, a friend, a woman in love. She was complete. The years passed, and Hazel and Cole grew old together, their love enduring, their bond unbreakable, their lives intertwined. They watched their children grow. They welcomed grandchildren. They shared their stories. They lived their lives to the fullest. One evening, as they sat on the porch of their ranch house, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple, Hazel looked at Cole, her eyes filled with love, with gratitude, with peace. "I'm glad you came to redemption, Cole," she said, her voice soft and filled with emotion. He smiled, a warm, loving smile that reached his eyes. "Me too, Hazel," he said. "Me too." They held hands, their fingers intertwined, their hearts connected, their spirits united. They had found each other. They had built a life together. They had created a family. They had found love. The desert stretched before them, vast and beautiful, a testament to the enduring power of nature, of life, of love. The horizon beckoned, not as a boundary, but as a promise of peace, of happiness, of forever. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a final, golden glow on the landscape, bathing the world in a warm, comforting light. Hazel and Cole sat together, in silence, in peace and love. Their journey had been long and arduous, filled with challenges and triumphs, with grief and joy, with loss and love. But they had made it. They had found their way. They had found each other. And in that moment, under the vast, star-studded sky, they knew that they were home. The end.